help me with pronunciation. It's Zolal Habibi.
Zolal has L at the end.
Zolal Habibi. Zolal Habibi.
It's the font. It looks like an I. It's the font.
Yeah, you're gonna have to apologize.
Yeah,
We're about to do an entire couple of hours of butchering a lot of names, so apologies in advance.
No, it's something that you get used to after decades.
Of talking to enough Americans, right?
What was interesting was my brother's wife. She's American, and so the first time that she was meeting me, like my brother, like for the first time in his life, he realized that my name is difficult for others, and he was like, "Hold on, your name is very simple. I don't know why she had to practice all night practicing your name." I was like, "Yeah, it's difficult for people," and he's like, "Really? I never knew that." I was like, "Oh, growing up, that was always the issue."
And you've been in the U.S. for, I mean, you kind of grew up in your teen year, right?
I was born and raised in the U.S. and I
mean, you're like next door neighbors to the
I've
Shah,
lived
right?
in-
I mean, isn't that there's like a neighborhood and
No, we were in. No,
you weren't on speaking
Virginia.
terms. You could have been in that. There's a new show called The Neighbors.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is that we knew people who were in his circles,
Really?
like friends of mine, and I was like, I remember like one time I found out that there was this guy who was friends with my cousin, and it was spring break. They had all come over to our house, and just like I was in high school, they were in college, and we're just like hanging out with one another and everything. And he was like bragging to everyone about like this new car that his dad had bought him and everything. And I was just listening, and I just started like putting things together, and I was like, oh my God, his dad was one of like the highest people in the Shah's government. And I'm like, are you so-and-so's son? And he was like, yeah, my dad. I was like, your dad?
Up and say, hey, I helped finance your car.
Get out of our
I
house.
helped finance your car.
I was like, you know what? You shouldn't be bragging about that car because it was bought with the blood of the Iranian people. And so everyone was like laugh, like our friends, like that circle of friends, they all knew like I have very strong political, stances. And so they were all laughing. He was just shocked because he had never seen anyone approach him that way in regards to
so do they live kind of a high status in the U.S. where everybody's like, oh, the Iranian Shah?
Yeah. No, I mean, his father was like one of the top commanders of the the eternal, what they call the eternal guards. What is he calling it these days? Something like that. But
those are the morality police, right?
Immoral.
Morality police, or
right. That is their current regime. But the Shah had the immortal guards, so it was the equivalent to the IRGC. Gotcha. So his father was like one of the top commanders of that, and I was like, oh my God, I can't believe you're in our house. Get out. My father was in prison during this.
Well, we're gonna break into all of that, so I don't want to steal any thunder. So let me introduce you real quick. Today's guest, Zolal Habibi, an Iranian-American human rights activist and fierce advocate for women's empowerment. Zolal offers a rare, deeply personal perspective on Iran's struggle, the pain, the courage, and the enduring hope for real freedom and justice. So thank you so much, Zolal, for joining us today. We have been looking forward to this topic for a while, and unfortunately, it remains a top global topic. So,
we wanted to talk about it before the war, the conflict, or whatever.
Exactly. Back with protests, and then by the time we got here, we're like, oh well, of course we have ships.
It escalated quickly.
Yes, it's Ethan's fault. Ethan drew out this strategy in a prediction earlier on. So I thought it would be fun just to set the story. If maybe we can start in the early 1950s, and really maybe you can sort of dictate a short little timeline story. I mean, because here we have this amazing doctor who comes in, but even before that, I don't want to be light, just to give perspective. I've been to Ukraine. I have witnessed many Shahid drones. And so very familiar, unfortunately, with the war topic. So I try not to take it too serious, but also serious in a light-minded way. But Iran has unfortunately been a ping pong ball. And when I say that, I mean the British, mainly it was the British winning, but with American help in the early 50s, to seize some of what Iran has, which is vast amounts of resources, and one of them is oil. So, for good reason, this doctor came in and tried to make that a state-run company to try to make more than just 16% on their oil. And then from that, we had an American coup that stepped in and helped us basically put in place what was the Shah. And the Shah had some interesting policies that I think the story of Iran, there's a struggle and a pull as I've done this. And I go back, I am from the era, it's been 22 something years since I was in collegiate debate. And Iran was one of our top topics. So at the time, it was Ahmadinejad was like top of the news constantly. And he was so dapper. If you remember, he never wore a tie. So he was always part of every debate we had. It was always like, and at the time it was, Iran will have nuclear weapons in 6 months. And that was like a push, which we seem to still use that line, which I've learned is not reality. But maybe you could.
We stopped that now.
Yeah, we stopped it. Yeah. Well, we did that back in June, right? So now we've stopped it again. It's been another 6 months. So. But maybe you can give us a little story, a little set the stage for some of the players, if that works for you, just because I think having some of that history helps set the stage for conversations of what's going on now.
Yes, well, Iran does have a very interesting story, and sometimes it's very painful for Iranians, especially because the struggle for freedom in Iran has been continuing for 120 years. From the 1906 constitutional revolution till today, we have had numerous revolutions, but unfortunately each one has been very short-lived and has not given the fruit that the people of Iran desired. And for the most part, it has been due to foreign intervention. So if you just go back like the last century, we've had
mainly Australians, mainly Australians.
Reza.
I think Iran is a preview of what's going to
Reza
happen in Australia. Sorry, but keep going. Zolal, sorry.
I hope not. But the reality is that, so even when you go back to the start of the Pahlavi dynasty, Reza Khan, he was just a general in the army who was brought in through a coup d'etat by the British. Once he wasn't serving their purposes anymore, he was put into exile and he was replaced with his son. And he died 3 years later in exile. His son didn't even have the courage to stand up to the British to bring his father for a proper burial into Iran. But the reality is that at the beginning, Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, he knew that he had to stay in check because otherwise they would replace him the way they had his father. So at first he was very much aligned. But then, and that is why there was a time period in Iran that people were able to push forward with the messaging that they had from the 1906 revolution, that we want a constitutional monarchy. So fine, you're a monarch, but there needs to be an independent prime minister. There needs to be elections. There needs to be parliament that is independent or whatnot. And so the result of that was Dr. Mossadegh becoming the prime minister of Iran, the only democratic government that Iran has ever seen in the last century. But unfortunately, it was only for 2 years. Dr. Mossadegh was able to nationalize Iran's oil. As you mentioned, the people of Iran were seeing only 6% of the oil revenues of Iran, and the rest was going to BP or British Petroleum. And also there were some US stakeholders too. And so when he nationalized oil, the ripple effect, it wasn't just Iran, it was the effect that it had on the entire Middle East. Iran has always played a very important geopolitical role in the region. From there, you see the movements forming in Egypt and other countries. And so the Middle East that was in the hands of Western countries was seeking its own independence. And being that it is the region with the most natural resources, that was not something that they were going to take lightly. And so unfortunately, there was the coup d'etat by the CIA and MI6 carried out against Dr. Mossadegh.
Jeffrey Epstein. But I don't mean to bring but Jeffrey Epstein too, right?
Not Epstein again. Ignore Ethan.
Yeah. And unfortunately, Dr. Mossadegh was taken out through the coup d'etat, and the Shah was reinstated. And at that time, the Shah, first of all, he felt that he was in a higher position now because he actually had the backing, true backing of the US and everyone at that time, the British and the US specifically.
Strange part
And
about the
so
Shah
he
is not only
actually,
the CIA was assisted him, but he also had help from the Mossad at the time, right?
uh, no,
What's the
he
difference?
did
Joe,
not
what's the
have,
difference? No, I'm
no, there
kidding.
is a
I'm kidding. I know.
difference,
I'm
but
just,
no, because the Shah actually had a pretty tough stance in regards to Israel. If you see, I don't know if you've seen his interviews in regards of how the US is controlled by Israel and this and that. And at the time in the Middle East, the issue of Palestine and Israel and everything, that was a hot topic. So that wasn't the case. But the reality is that at that time, what happened was the Shah saw it as a green light to be able to consolidate power in himself. And so that's when we see the growth of the Sabah and the Sabah taking over. We see that all organizations, associations are banned. Iran becomes a one-party country, and the Shah announces it as the only party. And if you don't like it, you could either leave the country or you're going to be arrested. And that quote still is available in the newspaper and everything. And so the Shah, he wanted to show himself as like a strong power in the world. And it does go along the same lines as his father was going, I guess, because his father also, one of the things that threw off the British and everyone in regards to his father was like his messages to Hitler and the fact that we're Aryan, you're Aryan, so we're the we're the same.
The Aryan
But
Brotherhood.
yeah, and it's interesting that the current the clown prince, as we call him, but the Reza Pahlavi's daughter actually posted the letter from Hitler to his her grandfather or great grandfather on her Facebook, and it still
I'm proud of
exists.
it.
And I'm like, I don't know if that's something to be proud of, But unfortunately, that is a mentality that it's very alarming for Iranians. But we are seeing a lot of that, especially in the last few
Now the
months among the
MEK
supporters of
had sort of
monarchy.
it started in this time period, right? I mean, it was
Yes, in 1975. The three founders of the MEK, they were students at the time. And they were the ones who grew up, like that generation who grew up with, the memories of Dr. Mossadegh and becoming activists after, the coup d'etat. And they were part of the Netzat Azadi, which was like the front that was the continuation of Dr. Mossadegh and whatnot. And then all of those organizations and associations were banned. And Bozagon, he was put on trial. And in his trial, he said, we are the last generation that is going to fight you, the Shah, the regime, with just diplomacy or trying to do that because you've shut down all means to be able to create any kind of reform within this system. So they were 3 students and they got together and they said, what is the solution? What are we going to do for our country? And a lot of times when I think of them, the fact that they were in their 20s and they saw themselves responsible to change the path of the nation. And they started doing that and working on it. And they, it was the time of revolutions in the world, right? This is in 19, sorry, I think I said
70s,
the
yes.
year wrong. It's
yeah,
1965.
right.
Sorry.
I can say
I'm
because you're
translating the
before,
date.
right? Yep.
It's 1965. Yeah, it's 1965. And this is, as we were saying, it's like 12 years after the coup d'etat. So they had those memories from back then too. But what's interesting to me is like it was the time that a lot of other underground organizations were coming together in Iran too. Like there was the the Fadain organization and others who were forming at that time too. But unlike them, they all mostly went with, whatever ideologies exist in the world at that time and following that path and like going on a path that has already been set and just following on that. But they decided not to do that and they decided to actually go and study all the different ideologies, all the different revolutions in history, and to try to draw a conclusion from all of those. And then also having I guess, more of a ideological understanding of like religions and their roles and everything. And so they came up with this new concept, and they put together the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran. And it's very interesting to me that how they were able to foresee like the things that we're going to come across. And they studied for 6 years, just working on the principles and values instead of actually doing something like activity, and then starting to recruit people, individuals, and forming these groups that they just studied everything to be able to come up with that correct path. And that, to this day, like some of the things that they set,
Valid.
those are still the same principles that our generation, or even the generations now after us, were, that is what drew them to this movement. For instance, from day one, they drew the line. They're like, the line does not lie between those who believe in God and those who don't, because that was like the time. It was the Cold War era. And this is like one of the slogans in Iran at that time against the USSR. Communism was dealt with the communists who say there's no God, or things of that nature. Like the mullahs, that is like what they used. And they said, no, that's not where it lies. Where it lies is between those who are being oppressed and the oppressor. And that was the basis of this movement to this day. That is where we draw the line. It doesn't matter if you agree with me ideologically. Those are your personal choices that you make in your life. But if you are being, suppressed, if you are being, exploited, we are going to stand for you and with you. And I think that is what has really set the grounds for us. And also the fact that they said, we are here to, the path that we set and we're going to be able to open is with sacrifice. It's not with anything else. So you don't need superpowers. You don't need to have the support of this or that. It's important that you are able to stand by your principles and be independent and open your path by making sacrifices in your own lives to be able to push that forward. So that is how the MK
The Shah at that time, I don't know how to dance around and say this, but he was trying to be quite liberating. In the name of liberation, he actually outlawed being able to wear the hijab, correct?
No, that was his father.
Did, okay.
His father did that, but when he did that, he actually pushed the women into their homes.
That's those who would want to wear it.
That was
like, wait, now I can't wear it, so then I have to stay home, right?
Yeah, and that was also, you have to understand, this is 100 years ago. Even back then, in a lot of like European countries, people still had like head covers or scarves. Like in Greece,
well, Eastern Europe, it's
like
very
very
common to wear a scarf. Right?
And so they found it humiliating to be
not allowed to.
First of all, the fact that they didn't have the right to choose their lifestyles or whatever. And then also their parents really would not allow, like the fathers wouldn't allow their daughters to go to the streets anymore or whatever. So automatically it was pushing. So it's the same thing. I mean, the fact that you actually allow yourself to dictate how women should dress or not dress, it doesn't make a difference if you're the forced hijab or the forced malveiling. I mean, the forced unveiling of women. It's the same thing. It's the same
Ethan
concept.
does this. His daughter's like 2, and he's always forcing her to wear certain clothes. It's like, Ethan, lay off.
No, I was talking to Joe about this last week, is that Americans don't even need to make it a law. They just shame each other. They just shame each other into what's societally accepted. You know what I mean? So I think
the fact that like they even consider women as an object that you could dictate to them, like, this is what you have to do. This is what I want. It's their own personal choices, and you have no right to be dictating to anyone how to dress or how not to dress or what to do or what not to do.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, like, so even they make it a law there. In a law, it's not, in America, it's not a law to oppose ICE, so to speak, right? But the social shaming of ICE is to such a degree now that it's completely socially acceptable to attack police officers. So in a way, I feel like Iran is like a stress test for the Middle East. And that's why there's been hundreds of years of stress testing. How do we keep control, but kind of give the illusion that we're giving the people some freedom, right? And I'm saying Iran is the same as everyone else in that fact that freedom isn't given by the government. But at the same time, I feel like Iran has always, because it is such a valuable place, it has been that stress test for the entire Middle East. And like
Well,
you were saying before, when something happens in Iran, you see it happening everywhere else.
well, you bring up a good point about control and doing that, because even during the Shah's time, it was a very misogynistic period. And now is the last 40 years have definitely been misogynistic. And
It's
so
the
it's
same.
almost like if you
I
can
mean,
if you can
it's yeah.
force a woman to have to only be if it has a male accompany, or to do anything must have his husband's approval. I mean, haven't you
Permission.
controlled almost 50% of the population?
Exactly. That is exactly what Khomeini did from day one, to be able to control. I don't think his issue was so much religion, because to be honest, I don't consider the mullahs to be religious at all. I think they're just using the
Oh.
name of religion to commit whatever
And this is
atrocities
the
they want
fundamental
to.
regime.
So
Like the Senate,
right.
like the Senate,
yeah,
like
yeah,
the US
exactly.
Senate.
What they're doing is really like, when you have control over half of society automatically, then you're able to have a complete control or grip over society, especially when you enter the most private issues of a family, right?
100%.
So that is what Khomeini did. And during the Shah's time, as you just mentioned, unfortunately, the Shah realized his father's mistake. So he removed that forced unveiling, but he also had very misogynist views. But the reality is that, as I said, for 120 years, people have been fighting for freedom in Iran. Part of it has been women fighting for the right to be present in politics in Iran. And the reality is that, yes, the Shah had the white revolution, but that was because he wanted to show to those Western countries that were pushing him in different directions, like that he is willing to reform certain systems or whatever. So he would try to align himself more with them. It wasn't necessarily that he actually believed in a lot of these reforms. And if you go into the details about those reforms, some of them, they were presented one way, but the reality was something else. So it wasn't really benefiting the people. There were other ways to be able to have a more beneficial outcome. But I'm not going to get into the white revolution, because that's going to be
I was
a
going to
whole
say,
chapter
we'll go on a
in
tirade if we do
itself.
that one. So.
We've only got a little
Yeah,
bit. Yeah.
exactly. And so, just to, reach to 1979, I think that one of the turning points was the 2,500-year celebrations that the Shah created. You have to understand, in that climate, that people were living in poverty. There were shanty towns on the outskirts of Tehran at that time. And then the Shah was having these celebrations. They were having the food be delivered from Paris. And in those situations,
They don't have lots of frogs in Iran.
creating
They don't have
that,
frogs in Iran.
no, they actually had their catering done by this very prominent French company. I don't know if you've actually ever seen documentaries about the 2,500-year celebrations. And that was like one of the turning points that led to the 1979 revolution, because people were
Starving,
seeing,
and here
this.
is,
Let them eat cake.
Let them eat
Yeah,
cake.
this-
Exactly.
Exactly. And just how out of touch the Shah was with the people of Iran. And the fact that he was willing to use all of that to just really make himself stand in a different position in the international eye. He just wanted to make himself, because that's where he announced himself as the king of the kings, right? And he had the celebration be in Paris, to be able to try to make like that connection between Cyrus the Great and himself or whatnot. So it was like one of the turning points. And that was also during the time that the Soviet was very brutal, and a lot of people were arrested and killed at that time. So people had those fresh in their minds. All of the people who have been executed, tortured. The Soviet was notorious for its, tortures methods. And unfortunately, the Khomeini kept Soviet intact, just had the tops were just replaced. and it was just rebranded as Vevok instead of Savak. So the same systems, the same prisons, the same brutalities continued. And it led, I think, one of the turning points was you see how these revolutionary groups formed in Iran and they were fighting against the Shah. But at the time, they were all underground. The only network that was free to work in Iran, aside from the fact that all associations had been shut down and everything, was the mosques. And why? Because the Shah actually needed the backing of the clergy to justify his rule. He called himself the shadow of God on earth. And he said he the divine calling, and he had a dream when he was 5 that he was at he was chosen by the prophet and this and that. He wanted to make that connection, so he needed the clergy to enforce his power. And in fact, if you look at the names of this dynasty, all of them are Reza something. For instance, it was Reza Khan, and then it was Muhammad Reza, and then like the rest of the family is also like Ghulam Reza, Ahmad Reza, Ali Reza, everything Reza. And the reason is because Reza is the 8th Shia Imam, and is the only Imam from the 12 Imams in Shia Islam who is buried in Iran, and so has like Iranian heritage. And his burial site is in Mashhad. And so he wanted to make that connection. Like, I am the descendants of the 8th Imam. And he made a note of that. And it's interesting that the number of mosques grew from 500 to 5,000 during the years of Muhammad Reza Pahlavi. All the revolutionaries were in the prisons or executed or whatnot. And what was growing instead was these fundamentalists and the mullahs and their network. And in fact, that's why we believe that Khomeini was truly the heir of the Pahlavi dynasty. And it was the Cold War era at the time. 6 months before the fall of the Shah, Western governments kind of knew that it was about on the brink of falling apart. So what they did was they had a conference in Guadeloupe in France, and they had brought Khomeini in from Najaf. Khomeini was in Iraq in exile for 20 years. And in Paris, they had negotiations with him. And they came to the conclusion that, well, maybe it's better for us to have him than progressive movements in Iran, because Iran has a large border at that time with the USSR and everything. So unfortunately, the people of Iran have been paying the price for that.
And quite amenable.
Decision
There was
for 47 years
a plan
now.
for to be amenable with some oil exploration, but that never came to fruition, obviously. But there are similarities, even though they contrast so much, in the sense that it was the name of a new start. Everyone thought it was going to be short term. It ended up going on for 40 years. They sort of usurped an original movement to then seize power, in how the Ayatollah ultimately took power as the supreme leader. Do you have any sense of the mindset of people in this time and how it compares to now, in how they felt this new kind of, I don't even want to call it a theocracy. It really was a theocracy that got turned into a dictatorship. But how they felt, did that represent what they wanted, or did they feel it was being hijacked even at the time?
I think that at first you have to understand the circumstances. People knew what they didn't want, but they weren't really sure what their choices were. It wasn't like the age of technology like it is today, that there's internet and there's media and whatever.
AI.
People really didn't know Khomeini much.
Gotcha.
AI
Chat would have
is
been so useful.
pretty dangerous
Yeah,
right now.
chat. What should we do, chat?
Yeah. So people just automatically, they saw this like elderly man who was supposed to be clergy and whatever. And he said, I don't want to have anything to do with power. And once I, come
You know what that
in, I
means.
will go to Qom, and I don't want to have any part in power. And unfortunately, he never went to Qom. He stayed in Tehran until the day he died. So people trusted that. And it was also being hyped at the time. That is why, I don't know if you know, like the history behind Iranians have this, I guess, hate, or like this hatred in a way towards BBC Persian, because BBC Farsi was actually working back then, the radio, and it was being broadcast into Iran. And that was one of those things that actually promoted Khomeini a lot right before the war. I mean, right before the revolution. So kind of like what Iran International is doing today with really put him in this holy man and giving this ish to people. And people didn't know any better. But those who actually knew the mullahs, they were actually very concerned about the mullahs coming into power, especially those who had been in prison and had seen like how they were, or like, for instance, I had always heard from my own grandfather. My grandfather was part of the clergy, but he was opposed to Khomeini. And because he had studied in Najaf himself, so he knew who Khomeini was, he was like, this is bad news. Told by your dad and everyone in the family, like, this is really bad news. You guys don't want to have to deal with them. But that was the reality of Iran at the time. And so people had a lot of hopes for the revolution. At the time, the revolutionaries were mostly in their late teens, early 20s. It was a time of really the first 2-3 years, I guess the first 1 or 2 years, I guess, was really a time that Iran was like flourishing. The people were really happy that they finally were able to put aside monarchy and create a republic. But then all of a sudden the constitution came out and they're like, choose between monarchy and republic, but Islamic Republic. And everyone's like, what is going on here? But they were still naive. They didn't understand what was going on really. I think the only person who actually touched on it was Master Rajavi 4 days after his release from prison. He gave his first speech in Tehran and he said, long live the Democratic Republic of Iran. And everyone started questioning him, what do you mean by Democratic Republic? It's supposed to be Islamic Republic. And he was like, we didn't revolt for Islam. And everyone was like, but you're Muslim, And he was like, no, that's not what we stand for. We stand for a secular government, even though we are Muslims ourselves. And that is actually true Islam, would mean believing in a secular government, because there's, in the Quran, it says there's no force in religion. So you can't have religion be part of the government. That's the whole concept. And so Khomeini, from day one, he started realizing like, they're bad news. The MEK is bad news for me. That is something that continued till June 20th, 1981. There was constant fighting going on, step by step, as the freedoms were being taken away from the people. But the resistance at the time realized that the last drop of freedom, we have to use it, because one day of having this kind of freedom to be able to be publicly working is not even comparable to years of underground work. And so they really tried to extend that as long as they could. But unfortunately, on June 20th, 1981, peaceful protest of 500,000 people was, Khomeini had ordered the Revolution Guards to open fire on the protest. And that day, thousands of people were killed. And from that night, the mass executions began in Iran. I know people who actually counted 200, 300 bullets that night in Evin prison, the coup de grace that were fired. And the reign of terror began since then. And 120,000 people have been executed in Iran for their political views. That is aside from, just look at January, thousands upon thousands were killed in the protest. Unfortunately, we don't have the exact numbers because of the internet blackout and communication blackout. But over 50,000 people were arrested during the protest, and a lot of their lives are currently in limbo. This week, they had 3 people executed who were from the protesters. This is how this regime has been able to keep itself afloat with executions. In 2025, 2,200 people were executed in Iran. Khomeini realized very early on that this is the only way that he could keep this regime afloat, and that's to spread fear in society. Because the message that they wanted to give from 1981 with the executions was, I show no mercy to anyone when it comes to my power. That is the one lesson that they learned from the Shah, because the minute the Shah, due to the human rights policy of President Carter, stopped execution and torture, 18 months later was the revolution. The Shah was gone. because everyone knew that the risk is just when you're in the streets. You might be killed in the streets. And they killed hundreds of people in the protest those years. But if you're arrested, they're not going to have you tortured or killed. And so that gave people that bravery to come to the streets in larger numbers and in the millions. That is the one lesson that the Khomeini learned from the Shah, not to do that ever. And that is like their red line, not to stop execution and torture.
It really is terror. But there's a unique thing about Iran that plays into this that we have to make sure to cover. And one of them is, and it's that strange time where different things, but after 1979, the fertility rate jumped really high. I think it was as high as like 7. Right now it's about 1.7. But there were many large
into the house.
Is that why? That's why they couldn't leave. They were locked.
That's why populations are decline now, Joe, is because the women are out of the house not making babies. Sorry.
So that's the solution. But population grew really big. Iran is one of those countries that has a really young population. So it's like 77% are under the age of 45, 70% under the age of 40. So this is a really young population with this decaying, small, older generation. If you just look at that right there says there's going to be an uprising. You just cannot keep that many young people. The other thing that's unique about Iran that has come out of the last 40 years is education. Women and men are both highly educated. It's like 98% literacy. It's really high. The U.S. doesn't have that high. So it's a very young, very educated population. And I do wonder, because this part I don't know, but how does religion fit into this realm? I know it's very high. It's like 90% are Shia. But if you follow many other countries, as education and youth are expanding, they're becoming less religiously affiliated. And I know it's not so possible to express yourself there, but maybe you have a sense or a feel of where that is fitting in. Because I just want to make sure we tell that story, as a lot of these protests are coming from various directions. And then the third one is that many women have been, there's a continual, it's like the story starts all over again, right? You have the Ayatollah who was broke when he got into office, if we call it. And now their family lives a life of luxury. And here you have this massive drought that hits Tehran. You have them trying to bail out his banking friends. So they're printing money. Inflation is hitting. So you have poverty again. And then you have the cronies at the top who are living a life of luxury. So maybe kind of fill in some of those gaps just to give us a sense of the inside scoop.
Well, you're exactly right about a lot of the things that you just said.
We're done. Awesome. We did it.
100%.
Thanks for listening.
100%. Top of the class.
The reality is that, like, as you said, over 70% of the population are Gen Z and below. So I think that the number right now is younger than 40. And the 70%, I think, is like 35 or something like that. But I remember like a decade ago, it was like 70% were under the age of 30.
Right, yeah. Well, I remember from college days, that was always the debate. It was like, it's that was big. Like the thing and you could just think of like this huge egg moving through the population. Yeah. So.
One of the reasons is also because of the Iran-Iraq war and the people who died during the Iran-Iraq war. And also life expectancy was very short back in Iran and during these years. So that is also one of the things that has triggered this difference in
population.
Because
it was considered one of the most
population.
Deaths for two established army conflicts of neighbors, right?
I mean, one of the things was also that the fact that the regime used actually children to open minefields. So it's that generation who would have been in their 50s now, right? And 450,000 children were taken to the minefields. Were given these gold plastic keys, and they were told that this is the key to heaven, and they would roll them in blankets and open the minefields that way instead of going and buying minesweepers. These are the atrocities that were committed or perpetrated by the regime.
This is Iranians. These are Iranian children, right?
Iranians, yeah. Iranian children. I mean, a regime that does that with its own future, you could just imagine how they value lives. And on the other hand, in regards to education, I think it's really important to understand two things. One is their Persian culture, where education is always very essential and very key. During the Shah's time, people it was very important for them, for their children to have a good education. Back then, unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for girls to continue higher education. But after the revolution, that was also created, because this is like a cultural thing in Iran. So right now, Iran has the highest brain drain in the world, unfortunately. But most people in Iran are very well educated, but they see it also as a form of resistance in face of this regime. Because the backward mindset of this regime, what would counter it? It's education, higher education, and trying to be able to reach somewhere, accomplish something. But especially, I think, for the women of Iran. 60% of university students in Iran since the 2000s till now, in the last 2 decades, have been women. It's not because there's positive discrimination for women or like they get like special treatment or anything. No, it's much more difficult for them to enter universities, but they see it as a way of resisting this misogynist regime. So they do that. And I think that's really important to understand that culture of resisting. And also from 1980, because the universities were where these revolutionary groups or progressive movements were recruiting members, Khomeini shut down all universities in Iran for 3 years. That's what he called the Cultural Revolution. Because at that time, Masoud Rajavi was hosting these classes of teaching evolution. And it differed from the mindset of the mullahs. And so they're like, this is bad news for us. And they shut down all universities simultaneous with the hostage taking at the same time practically. And for 3 years, all universities in Iran were shut down. So we have that background too. I think the younger generation of Iran, they are very tech savvy and they really yearn to see a true democracy in Iran. And that's why you see the role of the Gen Z of Iran in the uprisings and the protests. And I think they've learned from their previous generations too. I think that in the 1980s, the regime carried out the most gruesome executions and mass killings in the streets and public executions and hangings. It was also the 8-year war. So automatically, what it was, parents or families were trying to safeguard their children with their lives, because you didn't know back then, the regime would take buses into schools and take the children away from school without their parents even knowing and taking them to war. So people have just learned to protect their children, especially after the massacres from 1980 to 1988 massacre, where 30,000 political prisoners were executed in a matter of 5-6 weeks. If you look at the age of those people who were executed, then they're mostly under the age of 30, meaning when they were arrested, a lot of them were either teens or in their early 20s when they were arrested, because they were mostly arrested in 1981 or 1982, and then they were executed in the 1988 massacre. So after that, everyone tried to safeguard their own children. And so what do you see? For 11 years, there was practically silence inside of Iran until the student uprisings in 1999. And that was when our generation came to the streets for the first time. We had the student uprisings that lasted about a week. And then the regime also wanted to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So they were throwing off students from buildings and these gruesome scenes that we saw. And then 10 years later, there's the 2009 uprising. So there's a decade apart between the next major movement. But these generations, the Gen Z of Iran has learned that, look, if we keep on going back into our homes after each of these uprisings for like another decade, this just adds to the lifeline of the regime. And so that's where you see in the last 9 years, we've had 4 major uprisings in Iran.
Closer
and each
together.
time you see it evolving. Yeah. And you see it even evolving in the messaging and how radical it is becoming or the direction. And that is part and parcel, first of all, I think what this generation has learned from the past, but also being more informed because of the age of technology and communication. And also, I think it's the role of the resistance and the strategy that the Iranian resistance has pushed forward since in the last 12 years, practically, which is the strategy of resistance units throughout Iran. Resistance units are people who are local, but they organize in units. They work underground, but they're local. So they're groups up to 3 or up to 20 people. And they carry out a lot of different activities throughout the year. Like in the last year, they carried out about 13,000 different activities throughout the year. So if you just divide that into days, that's a lot. These are activities to try to raise awareness in society and keep the flame of hope and resistance alive, the positive messaging and things of that nature. And then they carried out.
I imagine that the biggest disappointment for all of them in the last, I would say, at least year or at least the last while before America stepped in was, I think they were counting on this age of viral virility, because you were talking about communication, you're talking about a population that's become more tech savvy, more educated. So they must have to be looking and listening to what's happening in the world and seeing, oh, people's problems are getting solved a lot faster today, because if they can get their message out onto Twitter or onto X or onto YouTube, then the world will see it and people will stand up and make a change. And the crazy thing is that the Western media is almost silent about what's going in Iran. And I know that there's also a blackout in Iran, but I believe that the Western media is letting everyone down as well. And they're supporting the standing regime because they're making sure that there is no uprising from us to put any more pressure on the Middle East, right? Like, so
that's sort of this policy of appeasement that seems to be taking place the last 40 years. It's like, well, just look the other way. Everybody else will scrutinize, but
we talk about the Iran people staying inside for 10 years. Well, what are the freaking Americans doing when they're, America will go out and take out a whole other country for liberation, and yet they will sit there and ignore students being massacred by the tens of thousands? What the actual F?
What?
I think it's a really good point that actually both of you just pointed out. And I think that's the cause of appeasement.
We're done. We got to keep doing this, Ethan. We're getting our egos stroked here.
The reality is that, unfortunately, we've always said that the policy of appeasement has taken a great toll on the people of Iran, and we've had to pay a grave price for it. We are the ones who have been used as a bargaining chip at the negotiation tables. If you even look at each of these uprisings, like, what was the internal reaction to each one? And sometimes you have to also read between the lines.
Chat told me it wasn't real. I asked ChatGPT. It took about 3 weeks before it actually started taking it seriously. And so that's the problem, right? So Chat can only reference peer-reviewed shit, and it can only reference what the journalists are writing, and the journalists aren't writing shit. Sorry.
That's true. Just to give you an example, something that happened 1 week before the start of the war. Not even 1 week, it's 5 days before. As I was telling you about the resistance units. So in 2025, the resistance units carried out 4,092 operations against centers of repression. Just during the uprising, they carried out 630 operations, which means risking your life, really. But they still did that because that was needed to be able to protect the protesters. And that was what was different this time. A lot of people couldn't put their finger on it, but they're like, there's organizational structure. You see that on the ground. You see hope in people's eyes. You see people who are disarming suppressive forces and protecting people. So that was the role of the resistance unit. 5 days before the start of the war, 250 members of resistance units carried out a joint operation on the headquarters of Khomeini and Pastor. That is the same place that was hit on the first day of the war. And that is something that is unprecedented in 2 decades. And that made a lot of waves inside of Europe because people in Tehran heard about it. But if there was complete censorship, a lot of media outlets, they got the news of it and they actually deleted it.
Or the temple's fallen, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. So the thing is that people were on their fronts. They're like, why are there tanks in the middle of Tehran? Everyone thought it was preparation for the war because there were threats then, but it had a message for people inside, both the people and the regime. First of all, for the people, it was, look, this is the most secure location in all of Iran at a time that they're on heightened security, but they still couldn't control their situation, even though they have 8,000 armed forces protecting this area. But these 250 people were able
They'll
to
penetrate.
get in. At least 100 of them were able to, pass that line and go inside. So that sent a message that the regime is in a much weaker place than everyone sees. And that really lifted a lot of spirits after that massacre in Iran too. And so they were setting the ground like, this is going to be the new norm. This is going to be the new
Gonna be
direction that we have to
escalating.
take. And then next, escalating the uprisings and taking the next step to be able to overthrow the regime. And well, right now, when there's bombs over your head, you
Right.
can't do
Yeah.
that. So that is something that's important. But I think the fact that, because it really bothered me, and it was like, okay, everyone knows that. People started reporting that things are being seen in Tehran, but automatically when that evening it was announced that this was the operation where resistance units, all of that was deleted. And I was like, this is exactly what people don't want that to be shown, because then it shows that the solution is the people of Iran. It's not a foreign war, and it's not the policy of appeasement. And this is something that we have been saying as a movement for decades. Mrs. Rajavi first said this 22 years ago at the European Parliament. So it's not something we're just saying today. Well, continuously, we have said, like, the solution is neither war nor appeasement. It's supporting the people of Iran to be able to create change through their organized resistance. And they have that capability to do it. Unfortunately, though, because of the policy of appeasement, their hands have been tied for decades now. And they are the ones who are being used as the bargaining chip. And even today, that negotiations are starting with the regime, automatically, like, that is one of the issues that's on the table. And Mrs. Raja always warned, she's like, look, the quote from Churchill still exists. Appeasement is going to lead to a war, finally. Do you not understand that? And unfortunately, the world saw it this year.
As we dive
the devastation.
deeper into that, will you give us a sense of who are the followers of this regime? I mean, I've heard numbers given where it's like 80% are like, no, we do not support this regime, but there's like this 20% that are still like, oh, this is the fundamental, still in. I mean, can you help put us the frame of mind? I think myself, I'm like, well, if you were a woman, like, how can any woman support this regime? And I have to think in the U.S. Something that's sort of germane in the U.S. is it was shocking to find how many women turned on Hillary Clinton when she was getting elected, and how many people were like, well, no, you can't vote for women. Women were saying, no, you can't vote for a woman. And so that was surprising to me. So I can kind of see it taking place, but it's so hard because as an American looking out, looking in, you're just like, who are these crazy people who would support this regime? This makes no sense. Like, yeah, just topple it. But they must have some kind of support in the country, but it's a frame of mind I don't quite understand.
Actually, according to the regime itself, it's less than 10%
Oh, really?
that supports
Wow.
the regime.
That would be similar to the Trump
that is why
administration,
it's
wouldn't it? I think there's only about 10%. Who claims Trump is a good administration? Sorry. I mean, I know in my country, 90%.
Put your MAGA hat on, so Chanel.
We voted our last leader in with less than 70% of the vote. We had 60-something% of the vote, and that clown's in. And now 90% hate him, but we can't get him out. I don't get it. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah, it would be hard if your election was you're electing someone for life. So the Ayatollah is a bit of a hard one because you're in for life.
Well, according to the regime itself, it's less than 10%. And the reality is that you have to pay attention to the strategy that this regime has had. I remember back during the Arab Spring, there was a lot of talks inside of Iran, like, why are we so invested in, Syria and whatnot, even for those who were regime supporters. And Khomeini, he reiterated this many times in his speeches that if we don't fight on the streets of Baghdad and Syria and Syria and Lebanon and whatnot, in Yemen, we're going to have to fight in the streets of Tehran, Mashhad, and Shiraz, and Isfahan. And that is exactly
that's
what
why
happened.
they've really been
That's how the US went to Iraq. That's how they went to Afghanistan.
So just look at everything since the fall of Bashar Assad. The Iranian regime has been on the downfall. So then the regime, even in 2009, when they wanted to suppress the protests, they brought in people from Hezbollah. Even in the previous uprisings, they've always brought the suppressive forces during the height of uprisings, they couldn't trust the suppressive forces of the regime itself, because they're like, a lot of them are now going to open fire on their own people. So they would have to actually move them around. So like, for instance, if your unit is from Tehran, you would be taken to Tabriz to not be
loyal,
local, face to face with people that or like your family is going to just disown you for doing this or whatnot. So the regime has always had to rely on that. And even during the uprisings this time, it still brought in proxy groups like from Iraq or Hezbollah from Lebanon, but it was about like 5,000. It couldn't bring in more because it doesn't have
and now it's
more
lost Syria as an arm. So I mean,
yeah, it has lost its foot in the Middle East. And the Iranian regime has always also done this because they use all of these. Khomeini used to say that war is a holy matter, because when you have a scapegoat or a smoke screen, that you could divert attention from what's going on inside of the country. That
like we're living through that right
so
now
like,
in our country.
Wag the dog.
Yeah.
Wag the dog.
Yeah. I've actually been thinking about that movie a lot lately. But the reality is that, I was actually talking to someone about that in February, first week of February. I was like, Wag the dog, this was the story. And they don't know. I was like, this is a story that, like, back when I was in high school, this movie came out. And this
Careful,
is what it
Ethan's
was.
about to bring us back to Epstein. So
well, everything is Epstein.
So the Iranian regime has always used
outside forces,
destabilizing the region as something to be able to stabilize itself in the in the country. So that has always been an issue. They know that they don't have to. They know that the people of Iran cannot. I mean, they just don't despise this regime, and that is exactly why it's not reformable. Because they know that if they give in a bit of leeway, they're going to be toppled down. And that is why even during the uprisings in January, the regime, for the first 2 weeks, they tried to really not use that much lethal force. But then they just felt like there's no way we can turn back the clock to January 27th. So we need something to be able to spread so much fear in society that people don't come to the streets again.
We still don't know
this is something
clear
that
numbers,
it
right?
wasn't
But
something that, no, we don't have clear numbers right now. And I mean, it's in the thousands, but we really don't know what the actual numbers are, because there are actually two sides trying to play with these numbers.
Right.
So you have
Political
to
reasons
just
on
wait
both
and
sides,
see,
right?
like, what are the, but on the other hand, just like in 2025, I remember in July, I think, or June in 2025, there was an article that came out in one of the main outlets of the regime that they used for like strategy planning. And it said, we need a repetition of the 1988 massacre if we want to keep
control
our grip on power. And that was very alarming to us at the time, but that is exactly what the scenario that they went through with during the uprising. So this is a regime that whenever it's on the verge of falling apart, that is what they turn to. The same way that after the Iran-Iraq war, Khomeini knew, like, for 8 years, he has suppressed every form of dissent in the country by saying, hush, we have a foreign enemy. And now that that's gone, people are just going to overthrow this
And by
regime.
foreign enemy,
so
you mean like, let's all consolidate because we must stop the enemy. So then it brings everybody together.
Yeah. That's, aside from just rallying under the flag, that would be like the positive version of it, but also the negative that if you are saying anything against me, so that means
you're with the enemy,
and
now
you're going to be
justifies
killed.
people.
Yeah. And so that is why Khomeini had the 1988 massacre, because he needed to spread that fear in society. And so at that time, every family had either lost someone or they knew someone who had been killed. And that is why there was complete silence till the 1999 uprising, when the newer generation came into.
Can we play with the hypothetical? Because we're about to get deep into current events. But before we talk about current events, let's say there was this uprising at the time the Ayatollah was trying to make sure to have his own 2026 massacre. He did have his own 2026 massacre. And let's say there was no attack from the US. So let's put that to the side. Where do you think that would have played out? I hadn't heard that those 100 students had made it to where the supreme leader was. So that's really interesting. It kind of tells that story. But do you think the massacre would have worked in basically putting a pause and a scare and frighten to the people to stopping? Or do you think it would have emboldened them to higher escalation of going into this? Because you do have, there's the Iranian army and then there's the IRGC, which was getting more and more power, so it seemed. And this is 100% an outsider looking in, reading news clips that are probably whitewashed or something. But that's what it seemed like. They were trying to consolidate power. But as you said, it was very hard. And with Russia not being able to assist at all, in fact, Russia was needing, they're more dependent on Iran than they could help. And so having really nothing there, where do you think that would have played out?
If we look at the last week before the start of the war, that in itself is a sign. February 22nd, universities resumed classes on campus in Iran. Since the uprising, classes have been held online, and because they had tried to evacuate all the campuses, because that was like one of the hotbeds of the protest during the uprising. The day that universities resumed in-person classes, protests began in the universities in Iran. So from that Saturday till Thursday, we saw protests and the regime shut down all universities again. They're like, okay, we can't control the situation. Till Wednesday. Thursday was the day they gave the statement that all universities will be shut down till the end, the spring break, because it's the Persian New Year is March 20th. So spring break is like till April 2nd in Iran. And we saw that. And then we also saw...
In other words, there was already some
Iran,
sparks of it escalating again.
Yeah. And the thing is that we also saw like simultaneous with the student protest, we had the attack that was carried out by the resistance units. And then if you go back a few days before that, it was in Iran, we have this thing that people usually hold ceremonies for the 40th day of the passing of their loved ones. And we were having those memorial services that were being held all over Iran for the 40th day from February 18th till the 22nd.
These are kind of
natural
Iran. Existing times where people gather as a mass, right?
Yeah. And so all of those memorial services, they turned actually into a form of resistance and protest in a way. And so people were there. First of all, families were not mourning, even though they were in mourning, but they weren't like, the memorial services weren't grieving services. Right. They were honoring the lives of their loved ones, and they were turning it into a form of defiance in face of this regime, and also making pledges to them to continue the fight and saying that we have nothing to lose anymore. Because you've taken what is the most important thing in our lives from us, we have nothing to lose anymore. And that's why we have no fear. A lot of these memorial services, suppressive forces did come. There were clashes, but people still stood. And that in itself was a sign for the regime too, that this time around, people are not giving in and they're not scaring away, because they're just, if we don't continue this now, it's going to take another 2-3 years. And then another 2-3 years, we will come out and then we will be killed by the masses again. And then back, this cycle is going to continue. We need to break that cycle. And I think this time around, people have learned from the experience of 2019 and 2022. And that's why that defiance was still there. And also the fact that the resistance units were mobilizing on the ground. I mean, during the uprising, right on January 7th, 2 cities were liberated by the protesters in Iran. Unfortunately, after about 48 hours, there was the mass killings and the communication blackout. So that's why it didn't continue. But that in itself had a sign for people in Iran that, look, if we actually work together, we have that potential. So we can do this. And it was setting a precedent for others. So like, this is the way that you could do this. This is how it works. And so people were passing that information on to one another really quick, and it was spreading really fast. So I think that if you look at how things were progressing, that was one of the things that becomes very key is actually what the Iranian resistance was calling for at the time. We were calling for a firm policy on Iran, indicating that the solution is not a war, but the solution is to actually stand by the people of Iran. And that is like in concrete steps. We're not asking for troops on the ground. We're not asking for financial support, none of that. What we are asking for, though, is putting an end to the policy of appeasement. So due to that pressure, after years of dragging their feet, the EU decided to blacklist the IRGC. As mentioned, the IRGC in recent years has, they have like a monopoly on Iran's economy. So that really cripples this regime once the IRGC is placed on the terrorist list. The UK has yet to do so, even though the British
After
Parliament
all of
has
this, they're still not
asked
going to.
for
Right?
this. And they've been calling for this. The majority of the British Parliament has been calling for the blacklisting of the IRGC since 2022, and they still have not done so. So that also gives a message to the Iranian regime that, look, we still are willing to work with you. If you're able to pull yourself out of this deadlock, we'll still be there. Those are the messages that Iran has been getting from the Western governments. And the technology that the regime has been using.
I'm really confused because do Iranians think that Americans are on their side? Because Trump hasn't said at all that he's liberating Iran. He's come up with any other excuse.
It's a fun one because the message has changed.
Yeah, and then
right?
secondly, from what you just laid out, it sounds to me like the regime called up the US and said, hey, we're having some problems controlling the population again. Can you drop a few bombs on them so they stop protesting? And then one more thing that I've heard Trump say, he wants to use nukes. So I don't get it. Do the people of Iran actually think America's on their side? Or it sounds to me from an outsider that Trump administration and the regime of Iran are just fighting over who gets to kill people in Iran.
I think Ethan's really trying to get down to is where's the line between, all right, we're going to get rid of the policy of appeasement. But at the same time, correct me if I'm wrong, but Iranians are like, we don't want foreign intervention. That's not what we're looking for. It's like, don't turn a blind eye. And so really it's the soft power of like, add IRGC to the terrorist list, start.
Recognize the right to resist in face of this regime. Instead of labeling it as terrorism if anyone does anything against this regime. Or like technology. Look, if there was any communication blackout, those protests would have continued. The regime would have had the open hands to kill at point blank on the streets, like mass killings that they did. Hold the regime accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The videos that there is so like something that's just old. It was this January. The regime entered hospitals, but killing people on hospital beds who were wounded from the protests. Those are war crimes. Why isn't Iran being held accountable? And the Iranian regime is using some of the highest face recognition technologies and like all of these other technologies that they're actually purchasing from Western countries.
Is it OpenAI or is it
just stop doing that?
Or is it? No, I'm just like.
Yeah, it's different companies like throughout. I know Germany, like races from Germany and Sweden and a lot of these countries that they're purchasing.
So where's Elon Musk's Starlink? We need Starlink.
Actually, we're trying to get Starlink in there.
Because that's what they've been using Starlink in Ukraine, haven't they?
Well, Starlink actually stopped working in Iran and they could have gone around it, but they didn't. And that is exactly the type of things that the world could have done to support the people of Iran. That is the type of support that we need. We're not asking for anything else. But the reality is that, unfortunately, as we said at the beginning, because Iran is a rich country in natural resources, and there are a lot of people who have different interests in Iran, and unfortunately, we're paying the price.
If we could jump into current events, because it's exactly what you're talking about, but I want to make sure now we set the stage for what this was this year. That the amount of poverty that was out there, inflation had hit really high. And a massive amount of this inflation is they ran out of foreign reserves and they were bailing out these, you could say, the regime-based banks with mass amount of printing. So inflation hit really high. Tehran specifically was faced with a drought that they have never seen before. And so all of a sudden, they've got a growing population, lots of people. And with this drought, it dried up 4 different water sources to Tehran is gone. And so there's already currency going on. There's now a drought. So you actually have a time in history where this is a famine sweeping through this country with a very educated young population. And so it's already kind of fomenting. And I want to mix that because there's already electrical issues. There's already electrical outages happening throughout Iran. And I only want to put all that in context because...
Yeah. And the last year, practically, people in Iran haven't had running electricity for like at least 2-3 hours a day. And that has created part of the economical crisis too, because people are not able to work. For instance, from bakeries,
anything,
whose, everything is going bad because the dough is ready and needs to be baked now, and there's no electricity. Even small mom and pop shops, everything is affected.
So
by it.
bombing
Why
an
is there
electrical
water
plant
shortage?
would be 100%. Like, it's almost like sanctions. I remember debating sanctions 20-something years ago where we say, well, in Iran, you look at it, this is a terrible place to look at sanctions because sanctions end up hurting everybody at the bottom. And it's not like the people at the top are not going to continue to have a life of luxury. It would be the same thing. Like, if your threat is to go bomb an electrical plant, you're hurting the people that originally you said you were trying to help. So that's where this message has totally flipped on its face to where...
I think it's interesting if you look at the message that Mrs. Rajavi gave at the start of the war. She said, this war is starting because of Iran's nuclear program and missile program. It has nothing to do with the freedom of the people of Iran. So she made that clear. This is what this is about. It's not about bringing democracy to Iran, because democracies can't be installed in a country. It has to come from the people. And the only...
Just to be clear, Rajavi, she's in France, but she is leading of the MEK. Yep.
She's the president-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. And she made that statement on the first day. And that the only side that has the legitimacy to decide the destiny of the Iranian people is the Iranian people themselves. And I think that is something that's key to understand.
Which is weird because the White House is trying to say that now. It's like, oh no, we're going to give it to the people after we destroyed everything.
If they don't nuke it.
The infrastructure, the destruction that has been done in the past 25 days, it's more than the 8-year war in Iran-Iraq war. And the reality is that those infrastructures hadn't been rebuilt after all of these years. So just imagine the situation right now in Iran. So adding to the fact that, as you said, the reason that there was a drought going on in Tehran and in Iran, water shortage in general, is because the dams that the Iranian regime has set up to allocate the water for their nuclear program, and they're all run by the IRGC. So that is what we were facing. And then we had the shortage of electricity. That was also because of the coin farms and also the whole process, like everything, the fact that the infrastructure was very weak and was very old and things of that nature too. And when we had the economic collapse, the currency of Iran has lost all its value. And so before the uprising, people were barely able to make ends meet. Just imagine, like, the past 3 months has just been 4 months has been just devastation.
Exactly. So that's what I mean. Is
everything has gotten extremely worse.
Exclude American bombing, exclude protests. There is a crisis that is worth noting just in the situation that was going on. And then on top of that, these people rose up.
And the regime has no solution for it. Right? They can't do anything about it. So that is what's clear.
That's why I was calling it stress testing before too, right? Because it's almost like I see it happening worldwide, right? America's having some issues now. A lot of countries in Europe are having some issues. Australia is definitely having some issues. They reckon in 2 weeks we're going to be out of oil and it's going to be Mad Max for real. Like, they just imposed some new laws for like price gouging, and then every journalist are already kind of starting to suggest that we should start ratting on our neighbors if they're driving for fun and they're not driving to get to work. It is insane. And we're at the highest prices of housing, highest prices of food already. And so what I'm saying is, like Joe's implying, it seems like how much will these people take? And it sucks, but then it doesn't look like anyone's really trying to look for a solution. Everyone's just trying to make a gain out of the chaos.
Let's talk some hypotheticals now about solution, because the reality is they did bomb. I apologize. It's so weird because all I can do is apologize. I mean, this administration blows my mind. I think I'm with the world. Think like this is unbelievable. This is clearly Netanyahu leading, his dream of being able to do this. It's unbelievable. What is sad is, I mean, yes, there have been, I think, 9 American troops now killed and something like 30 injured, but it's up to, I think, like 1,500 Iranians have been killed from Americans' attacks. And so it's really in the forefront. It's grotesque. I mean, there are so many places, including the girls' school, that seem very war crime. I listened to our own Secretary of War, and to hear him chant like it's a sports game is just disgusting and distasteful in so many fronts. And the world seems to be in chaos, but they are stuck in this, where they're sitting now. I know this is, let's not bring up the Epstein files, but let's just say this isn't for a distraction.
Epstein's dead. He killed himself. It's all right.
Right. But I definitely think the White House is looking to try to find an exit. They want an exit. If they can get an exit, but they're now left, let's take the hypothetical that in the next 3 weeks they wind down and the U.S. is out. Right? Let's take that one, because there's going to be 2 hypotheticals here. Let's say that's the one, which is probably less likely. I think their thought process, which is probably a fair one, is they're going to leave Iran in a massive vacuum. And nobody would love it more than Mr. Putin himself to, even though he's stranded, but they've dropped sanctions on Russia. So all of a sudden, there are rumors that he might negotiate. Now he's not, because he's making an extra $21 billion a month. So he's eased a little thing. And he obviously needs something from Iran. I mean, these Shahed drones that they're manufacturing, there's got to be some kind of technology front that he gets from there, because a few times he has pledged his allegiance to the regime over the Americans when he didn't really need to. It wasn't a game plan that he would have to. So in that scenario, let's say the U.S. does leave. Where do you think that leaves sort of the resistance movement in still trying to claim something? Because now you do have a chaotic government, but they seem to have stayed intact, which is strange. So they don't seem to be that disgruntled, but you have an economy that's in crisis still. They have no answer to fix that. So you are going to be running up against food shortages, water shortages. So there's nowhere for these people to go but to get angry and protest.
You're right about that. And before this war, a lot of discussions that we had with people, I would explain to them, aside from an issue or principle or value, the reason that we say war is not the solution, even if you look at it from a military perspective, war is not the solution for Iran, because Iran is not Iraq or Afghanistan. Iran is very different.
Be clear, it didn't work. It didn't work in any of those countries either.
Yeah, aside from it didn't work in the long run. They did in the short term. They were able to overthrow the government or topple the government. So I mean, Iran is like 3 times the size of Iraq with 4 times the population.
90 million people, mountainous country. Yeah, this is
92. Yeah, exactly. And if you look at the terrain, we have mountains, we have desert, we have very crowded big cities, so urban areas, and then we have jungle and water and everything. So we have really everything there. So from what direction are you planning on coming in? If it's troops on the ground. And scenario like Venezuela, well, Iran was not a classical dictatorship. Yes, there was a supreme leader, but they still have some kind of a apparatus intact or a structure. So that's why when Khomeini is removed,
still there.
They have a replacement. The system is intact. It's still working and it still knows what it's doing. Even if you have some of the top commanders all killed or top people in top positions, the system is still able to run. While, like in the Shah's time, when Shah escaped Iran, 2 weeks later, the system was gone. So it's very different. And that is something that we have been saying from way before. Like, even if you look at it, it's not the same thing. It's not going to work that way. And I think that's something
This is
that
kind
they
of
didn't
like
take
cut off the
seriously.
snake's head. We
They
solved
didn't
the
think
problem.
that, they didn't think that the regime would be able to stand on its feet.
I don't think they were
after,
thinking that
you
far
know,
ahead. I honestly
Kham-
Yeah,
don't.
they didn't look at any of the scenarios because
so-
apparently a lot of these scenarios, everything that's happening is played out. We knew 20 years ago would happen. You know what I mean? Like, so they just didn't they didn't do their homework.
I think that back in like 2003, the Iranian resistance of that time, we were based in Iraq. The MEK
Right.
were based in Iraq, and they had the National Liberation Army. And they warned the Americans then that, look, take the threat of Iran seriously. And everyone just laughed out about it or didn't take it seriously
In fact, the
until
NCRI ended up disarming.
they came face to face with the IADs and everything. And then they realized, oh, the main threat was the Iranian regime. And we're like, well, you know what you did though? Instead of securing the borders, what did you do? You made a deal with the Iranian regime from before. And the Iranian regime said, I won't enter Iraq if you bomb the bases of the National Liberation Army. And you did. And you bombed all the bases, and then you disarmed them. And now you're suffering from it. And that is the price of policy of appeasement.
Because, I mean, we didn't talk about this,
Today
but
is 23.
MEK and the NCRI were listed on the terrorist list for, it was a couple of decades, right?
From 1997 for 15 years. And when they were placed on the terrorist list, it was the State Department stated in their daily briefing that this was a goodwill gesture to the newly elected.
This is really, this is the
president
epitome of
Iran,
appeasement. It's
Mohammad Khatami.
like, fine,
Yeah,
we'll
so
get along.
They even stated that this is a goodwill gesture to Mohammad Khatami. This is in 1996, Khatami was brought into power by Khomeini back then to be able to buy time, because that was like the whole thing. And he had like what did he call it? He said the dialogue of civilizations or whatever. And as a goodwill gesture, the MEK and the NCRA were placed on the terrorist list. That was just a goodwill gesture. It was all done overnight, and it took 15 years to be delisted through every single court system. And there was not one court verdict that found any trace of anything that had to do with terrorism. But despite that, they still dragged their feet for 15 years. And unfortunately, that came with the price of life.
And this always seems to be American and the West policy. It is more who will make sure to keep the oil flowing. And in that case, we'll
look the other way. In that case, they always have known. I think all governments today, they understand that like the National Council of Resistance of Iran is not one that will be giving any concessions to any other government. They have stood by their independence from day one. That is one thing that they stand for. They're like, we don't want any kind of foreign intervention. We don't want any money. We don't want anything from you, because they understand that if we have a saying in Farsi, no one scratches your back except your own finger. And that is what's key, because otherwise they're going to have expectations in return. And that is what we have suffered from for all these years. And you can't be true to your people and create a people's sovereignty in Iran unless you keep that independence and that integrity. And I think that has been very key for our movement, even though it has come at a very grave price. And we have literally been the main bargaining chip at the negotiation table. And every time we know it, and we're like, that is so clear to us, but it takes years for everyone else to learn about it, because somewhere it gets revealed that, oh, this is what had happened. You know, in 2003, the deals that had been made between the French government at that time and Iran, it came out, but we knew it from day one. It was clear for us, like everything that was happening, like, for us, it's clear what's going on. But years later, a reporter wrote a biography, and in that biography, it came out that he had left his bag in that room. Once the reporter said all left out, he went back in to get his room, and then the doors were shut. And they didn't realize that a reporter was there, and they made their final negotiations in regards to the attack that was carried out against the headquarters of the National Council of Resistance of Iran in 2003. And that minute, the reporter got up and left right when the meeting was ending, and he approached the French minister who was there, and he said, "What was that?" And he was like, "If you say anything about this, we will deny it." And that is the name of the book, that if you say anything, we will deny. But that reporter then realized 2-3 months later, this attack was carried out and people were killed. And internationally, there was this whole, chaos really. And he realized that it comes at the price of people's lives.
I mean,
this
that's really, when you
and
say
so
it's the Iranians who are paying the price, it really is with lives. I mean, everyone's toying with the largest population being just kind of victim to whatever these geopolitics are playing games with, which I think is a misfortune. Now, where it sits now, let's take the other hypothetical, which is probably more the reality, that this turns into a type of forever war. Hopefully there is no invasion. Hopefully, I would say, I think our country is smart enough, but I don't think the Americans are. I don't think they're smart enough.
Sounds like you might be doing it alone if you do, too. It's kind of crazy.
I know, it's weird. But this has gone from being like, hey, I mean, earlier days, it was like, oh, it's a feminist movement. They want the right to not have to wear a hijab if they don't want to. They don't want this morality, please. And then it really fomented into this young, educated group saying, actually, we want liberation. And then it's gone into where even Trump was getting involved and saying, we'll help you. And he did say, you better not do anything. And of course, there was the massacre. And then they went, and now the message has changed overnight. It was like so many different things where it's like the evil regime. They've killed all these Americans in terrorist attacks. And then it went to, they were enriching uranium again. And it's like, well, I thought we ended that in June. So
they find any yellow cake? Did they find any yellow cake? Yeah,
exactly. So the message kept changing, and the message now, as I see it, it's really now about global economy. It is the Strait of Hormuz, and it's like, okay, well, they're holding hostage. We basically can't stop them. They figured out all these drones, and we come in with our rockets that cost a minimum of $20,000. And we're having to use a whole bunch of those to try to hit a drone that cost, in some cases, $500 to $5,000 on the water-based ones. So now the numbers just don't play out, and they're stuck. And so now they're trying to get everything. So the world is coming together to say, we got to clean up the Strait of Hormuz, which is probably going to be creating a protected route for her flows of oil. Because there are some boats getting through, right? I mean, Chinese ships are getting through. Now they're letting all the regime ships get through. So we're funding it. So there are ships that are going through, but ultimately there's going to have to be this weird compromise. And then basically this tit for tat where they're going in that realm. Let's say that turns out to be it, that they stay there for a long time, sort of doing this. And the bombing of the area at large reduces. Do you think that will, because that's not going to fix the economic problem. It's not helping Iranians. It's not getting them water. It's not getting them food. They are going to have a bigger currency issue as they have right now. Where do you think that sits and plays out over the next, say, 12 months?
Considering the current situation in Iran and the current devastation from the war, like the infrastructures and everything that has been destroyed, I don't think that this is something that can be extended for so long. But I also don't think that I understand there's maybe logically a lot of things just don't make sense right now, but I don't think that a dragged out war is something that would be beneficial for the U.S. either, especially since it is.
I guarantee it shouldn't have been started, period.
Perspective,
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, from an American perspective, also with elections and everything in a few
You've got to
months.
be ready for China and Russia too,
that's
right?
going to be continuation. There are talks of negotiations now. I mean, the 15 points.
What's weird is Trump has said there's
official
negotiations, but then the regime has been like, we're not talking to anybody. So it's weird because.
Well, actually, there are
That's
Oh,
part
are
of the
there inner-
negotiation,
Ah.
Joe. That's
people in the
you
regime who are
say
saying
no,
that,
but you
there are
mean yes,
negotiations.
but you mean yes if.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I don't know if you guys have looked at the 15 points that they have set forth, and it's come out in some media outlets. About the first one is a ceasefire, a 1 month ceasefire. It kind of looks like the same scenario that they use for Israel
Exact
Palestine.
same format.
type thing.
Very little. That's what I mean.
as
Very
seven-
little of it
Copy
is
and
actually
paste.
about the
Copy and
original
paste.
things. Like nothing has to do with
Yeah.
Iranians.
Seven of the 15 points are about Iran's nuclear program. 2 is about the missile program, I believe. And then some of them are giving incentives to the regime, like removing
Yep.
sanctions, and this and that, or a nuclear power plant in Bushehr.
But all of them
But
concede.
Bushehr is one of those
concede,
cities
say-
that is being bombed like completely these days. I think that I think it's something that we probably can't make assumptions on, just because we don't know to
Right.
what extent this war will
Yeah.
continue. And
No,
that is when we should
played
be
this
making
game in
assessments.
Ukraine and Russia for the
But-
last 4 years. So every time I think I make an assessment, then it like drags on. I'm like, this is
Yeah.
unbelievable
And
that this is
so you-
what's going on.
We have to see how things go. But what I see as the solution is, I think that the earlier that we are able to bring this war to an end, the sooner we can see the people of Iran taking their destiny into their own hands. But the more this war drags out, the more damage that there is to the infrastructure and everything, and it makes it more difficult for the people to actually be able to do anything because they're in a state of devastation. So I think it's really important to understand that complexity. But I do think that the final solution is what we are seeing on the ground, what we are seeing. The direction of the people is going towards more mobilization on the ground to be able to fight against this regime. And I think that to a great extent, right now, after this situation, it would be very difficult for a lot of countries to be labeling the people as, for fighting back against this regime. And this is something that is of great concern. But it's not only just like, for instance, the Iranian resistance, as I mentioned, like the resistance units or the MEK or the National Liberation Army units of Iran. It's also like, for instance, the ethnicities of Iran, the Baluch, who do have armed resistance. I mean, this is also something that's, I think, very interesting to understand. The different ethnicities of Iran.
Kurds.
Iran has a lot of different ethnicities, and many of them culturally they're armed.
Right. It's like
So-
Texas.
The Baluch, the Kurds, the Lors, Lashwaris, and everyone, they are, for the most part, armed. So that is what the regime fears a lot too. And so I think that in every constitution, they could look at the French constitution, look at the US constitution. Everywhere this right is recognized. It's in the Declaration of Human Rights, universal rights, that you have the right to defend yourself in face of tyranny, but that needs to be recognized for the people of Iran. That's not what the people of Iran wanted from day one. But when there's no other avenues of you to be able to create change in a country, then that is the only thing that you're left with, when otherwise you're going to be met with bullets. And there is a solution. There is a viable option on the table for the future. As we said before, that the solution is neither war nor appeasement. There's a third option, supporting the people and their organized resistance. But for the solution, the final solution, we're also not stuck between two options. We're not stuck between the Kurd theocracy and the previous monarchy. There's a third option, and that's creating a secular democratic republic and having people's sovereignty. And that is what we are working for. And I think that here the test of time is really important, because there's a lot of people who don't want another Chalabi in Iran or whatnot. And that is true. We don't. And Reza Pahlavi is that Chalabi now for Iran. He has no organizational structure, no plans, no nothing. Finally, after 47 years, he's given a roadmap. And when you look at it, it's devastating. I'm like, it was better when you kept silent, because at least we didn't know what your plans were. But this plan is worse than your father's ruled. because even he had some kind of checks and balances
I
in
actually,
place.
I
You
did,
have
I
nothing.
did read
and
his plan. It was he wants martial law, and I was like, wait, what?
martial law for 20 months.
It was pretty
For
crazy.
20 months,
I mean,
there's going
I've
to be
sort of
martial
just
law.
written him off, so
Um,
that's why I don't take that
The
serious at all.
the revival of the Savant
That's
and
right.
the Immortal Guards. And I'm like,
It
so
worked so
what, are
well
we
the
just
first time.
He
rebranding?
just wants to
You know,
copy the same
and
playbook.
everyone was
Well, he's been in the U.S. for 40
Yeah.
years, so he's sort of figured out, like, oh, actually, this is great politics.
It works.
in one of his interviews. It's really sad that he actually does it. It's an embarrassment, actually, I think. But in one of his interviews, they said, "What is your merits that you could create like a democracy?" And you're just like, "It's like I've been living in a democracy for 47
Oh, I
years."
did
and I was
hear
like,
that. And he's like, I know how to do it. He's understood. He's learned. Our corrupt American. He's like, oh, I know how to do it now.
And I was like, "Yeah, I'm a feminist. I have 3 daughters." And I was like, "Oh, really?" And then, "Can you explain to me why your older sister is not the heir to the throne? If you're still such a feminist, you have an
Right.
older sister.
still-
She's still
Right.
alive."
He's a
And,
part-time
but,
feminist.
you know,
Part-time
that's-
feminist.
You can do that in the U.S. It's a gig
because he
economy.
has no other choice.
Right.
I mean, because he doesn't have a son, so
Right.
that's why
That's why he
his
claimed
daughter
it.
is now
Yep.
the heir.
Yep.
But
So it
So, I
doesn't
mean,
play for him,
yeah.
but for his daughters,
have
he
that.
wants to instill it. Right.
yeah, for his daughter, because there's no
Well,
son.
on that, oh, go ahead.
But I think the test of time is really important because, like, for instance, with the National Council of Resistance of Iran, the National Council of Resistance of Iran was formed in 1981, July 20th, 1981. So it'll be 45 years in a few months. And that kind of dedication that they have been able to actually create a coalition. There are people from different mindsets or beliefs who have come together in this coalition. We have people who are the Fadain, or we have like different ethnicities of Iran represented. We have the different people from different religious backgrounds who are present there, or people who are atheists. So we have all of that in the National Council of Resistance of Iran. They've been working side by side for 40 something years. That the 25 committees have complete plans for the situation. They understand the situation. So they're not making just sound bites of like, oh, this is what we're going to do. They're like, no, we can't talk about the future because we don't know how the regime is going to be overthrown to be talking about like, what are the next steps? We have to make that decision based on the actual assessment. But the fact that the provisional government's plan has been written since 1980 and has been completed over the years, but like the 10-point plan presented by Mr. Rajabi, which is kind of like the cliff notes of the interim government plan, it has been endorsed by over 4,000 lawmakers around the world, over 130.
He's got a
former heads
broad
of
reach.
states.
I have actually heard of things happening in other countries where he's got people trying to convince like Iranian restaurants and stores to wave his flag again. And so I have heard. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
But you bring up a really good point that I just want to recap to make sure we sum that whole idea. And that is the thought that there just will be this vacuum, that to follow the current regime is the only way to keep it organized and structured isn't the case. There is a structured and educated base in the MK and others that are ready to kind of fill this in an organized way and to have a government ready to go. And I think that's a really important thing. One thing I want to not push back, but
I just
go ahead,
wanted
please.
to add something to that. Sorry, just really quick. It was really interesting for me. Like actually it was about a week before the start of the uprising in December. There was a conference held here in France by the National Council of Resistance of Iran. And there were Iranian experts from different countries who came together in this conference, and they were presenting ideas and plans for the future of Iran. And it was very interesting for me to see some of the statistics, but also these people who were coming together. Like some of them, I've known them my entire life, but despite knowing them my entire life, I didn't know that they were so accomplished in their actual work because I've always known them as a supporter of this movement since I was a child, right? But then there are people who have like, one of them has about like 180 patents under his name. The other one, he is the head of one of the biggest projects in NASA right now, or the other one who is, a professor at Caltech, and this is like one is heading the top research Institute of Sweden, and all of these people coming together. And then all they had to say was, we yearn for the day that Iran will be free, for us to come and serve our
But he
own
would love to
people
come back.
and pro bono,
Yeah.
because that is everything that we have been dreaming of our entire lives. And so just imagine if that, the true asset that the Iranian people have, I don't think it's the natural resources that Iran has. I think it's the people of
Right.
Iran. And just imagine if the people of Iran could actually serve their own country. I think that then we would see really Iran be able to flourish. And I think that the scenarios that people try to present of power vacuum, there will be civil war in Iran, this and that, those are all to scare people off. But that's far from the reality of Iran. And they could be debunked in a conversation within 10 minutes.
Actually,
all
because
of those scenarios.
I think this might be my last question for you, and you have been amazing staying with us this long. I know it's late there, but I want to ask, because this is a question I think.
It's almost 1
I know. I
a.m.
apologize for that, but this is a question I think we're all prying on us, and that is, at what point does the Iranian people fall into what the regime at one time falsely claimed? It's like, we're in war, we must stick together. At what point do they come together because they are being attacked? I mean, the president of the United States threatened to bomb electrical power plants. Is there a point where there is a strange support for the regime just because they're being attacked, or is that line really been already crossed and it's not going back?
That line has been crossed because of the crimes that this regime has perpetrated. Everyone, at the end of the day, they do say, like, what is a foreign enemy going to do that this regime has not done to us already? And then in a lot of ways, the Iranian people blame the regime for the war because, like, they're like, well, you know what? Especially now that it keeps on, it's stated time and time again that, you know, it's because of Iran's nuclear program and Iran's missile programs and its meddling in the region and all of that. Who has been behind that? It's the regime.
It's not
So
because the people
that,
haven't been obeying. It's not like America's been saying, if you don't listen to your leaders, we're going to come bomb you. They've been literally saying they're going to bomb you because of your leaders. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think that rallying around the flag is realistic in Iran's scenario just because of the brutalities of the regime. And I think that maybe a few months ago, that would have been different. But I think everything that we've seen since especially January, I think that was like the hay that broke the camel's back for the people of Iran. That is still fresh in their minds. You know, it's one thing to say 120,000 people have been killed by this regime for their political views. It's another when you saw it yourself with your own eyes on the street.
Mourning at 40 days.
I have spoken to many people who were like, I personally saw over 100 bodies on the ground myself. I personally saw someone being shot. I personally saw, like, right below our apartment, a couple who was killed. And, you know, that is not something that is going to be easily forgotten. And also the fact that everyone know that Khomeini being replaced by Khomeini Jr., it's not going to be any kind of change, and it's going to be the continuation of the same thing, but more, I guess, more brutal in a lot of senses, because now he has that excuse of revenge and whatnot. So the people of Iran, they're just like, we can't give this regime more time. They don't want to see war because they understand the devastation. They understand that war is not going to bring democracy, and it's just going to be some of the infrastructures that have been hit. It will take like a century to rebuild the oil refineries and the gas refineries and all of that. It's not something that's easily going to be fixed. So they don't want to see the continuation of this war, but it's not going to become like a unifying force for the regime either. But unfortunately, every day that this war continues, the people of Iran are paying the price for it. And that is why, and not only the people of Iran, I think the people in the region, the numbers, when you look at it, like, I think UAE was hit by over 2,000 drones and missiles in the past few days, or other countries. And these countries are pretty small countries. I mean, the amount of missiles and, drones that are targeting them is quite devastating. And that is actually the role that the Iranian regime has always had, that destabilizing force in the region. And we need to make sure, from day one for us, it was clear that if a war starts, it's not going to stay within the Iranian borders, because Iran is the number one state sponsor of terrorism. So it's really important to understand that and the impact that it has. And the earlier that this war ends, the earlier we can actually start to see change being brought about by the people of Iran.
Zolal, you have been amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, being with us. Any last word? You get the last word. If you want to tell people where to find you or anything like that, please wrap us up.
Yeah, if people want to learn more, because we've covered a lot of different subjects today, but if you would like to learn more, you could always visit the website of the NCRI, which is ncr-iran.org. You can also visit mayamrajavi.com. It's mayam-rajavi.com, or mayamrajaviforchange.com to learn more about her views. I think that is something that we didn't have too much time to speak about that today, but it's what gives us hope that we can move forward to a brighter future. So I think a lot of people will find it interesting, especially like her views and progressive views, especially in regards to women's empowerment, the role of women in the future of Iran and all of that. And also like how we see the future of Iran, a non-nuclear Iran, why it's important to have secular democratic republic in Iran, the abolition of like the death penalty and all forms of torture and everything. So I think it's really interesting if people would like to learn more about it. And if anyone wants to reach out to me, I'm available on social media. If you search my name in X, Instagram, or LinkedIn, I'm there. So
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zolal. I know it's late, but I really appreciate it. Thanks for listening, everyone. Hostile Dysfunction. Until next time, we'll talk to you later.
Yeah, see ya.